As Islam's presence waned in Spain, the Pope faced little resistance in asserting his authority over the Church in the reconquered territories. The donation of Constantine, though falsely accepted as authentic by much of Western Christendom, granted him temporal sovereignty over numerous lands, and the inclusion of the Iberian Peninsula went largely unquestioned. In Spain, there existed no ecclesiastical institution strong enough to oppose him. The situation in Eastern Christendom, however, was quite different. The patriarchates of Alexandria and Antioch were as ancient as the See of Rome itself. The Patriarchate of Jerusalem, home to the Church of St. James, though younger, held a unique prestige as the guardian of the world's holiest city. Yet, it was Constantinople that posed the greatest challenge. While it could not claim the same antiquity despite its alleged foundation by St. Andrew, it had become the new Rome, having supplanted the old imperial capital. It was home to the unbroken succession of Christian emperors and stood as the grandest city in Christendom. Its patriarch could rightfully style himself as ecumenical patriarch, the foremost religious leader of the civilized world. Within Byzantium, religious factions occasionally sought to invoke the authority of Old Rome to counterbalance the growing dominance of the emperor. However, few in the East ever seriously entertained the idea that the bishop of the diminished Western city should wield any jurisdiction over the ancient and deeply rooted Eastern churches. Nonetheless, Rome continued to command a certain reverence. Though its claims of supremacy were dismissed, its primacy among the great sees of Christendom was widely acknowledged, even by the ecumenical patriarch. No one questioned the ideal that Christendom was, and ought to remain, united. Following the Arab conquests, the patriarchates in the southeastern regions saw their influence greatly diminished, leaving Constantinople to assume the role of protector of the Eastern churches. Numerous disputes and disagreements arose between Rome and Constantinople over church matters, though none were as grave or prolonged as later accounts would suggest. The general unity of Christendom persisted. However, in the 11th century, the Roman Church underwent significant reorganization. Much of the Reform movement was inspired by monastic ideals from Cluny and Lorraine and was initially driven by secular authorities who then controlled Rome. Emperor Henry III played a particularly active role, and his initiatives gained such momentum that even after his death, the Church was able to advance and eventually pursue these reforms independently, ultimately positioning itself in opposition to lay rulers. From this movement emerged doctrines asserting Rome's universal spiritual authority and its supremacy over secular powers. These assertions, in turn, ignited renewed conflicts with the Eastern Church. At the heart of the conflict was Rome's renewed assertion of its supremacy. Yet, the initial dispute focused on specific doctrines and practices. In its efforts to consolidate authority, the papacy aimed to unify church practices across Christendom. Beyond its desire to end the marriage of secular clergy, it also sought to standardize liturgy and ritual. While such reforms were achievable in the West, the Eastern churches followed different traditions. Greek churches existed within Roman influence, just as Latin churches were present in Constantinople's sphere. In southern Italy especially, the boundary between these two spheres had long been a matter of contention. Meanwhile, under German influence, the word filioque had been added in Rome to the creed statement regarding the procession of the Holy Spirit. The reforming popes, more uncompromising than their predecessors, refused to remain silent or flexible on such issues. Confrontations became unavoidable. When Pope Sergius IV issued his systematic letter, he included the filioque clause. In response, Patriarch Sergius II of Constantinople declined to commemorate the Pope's name in the diptychs of the patriarchal churches, signaling to the Byzantines that the Pope, personally, was deemed unorthodox on this doctrinal point. However, this action was not interpreted as a condemnation of the entire Western Church's orthodoxy. Conversely, in the West, where the Pope was seen as the ultimate guardian of doctrinal truth, this omission was viewed as a grave and far-reaching insult. The Patriarch soon realized that the prospect of restoring the Pope's name to the diptychs could serve as a valuable bargaining tool. In 1024, Constantinople proposed a potential resolution to Pope John XIX. The suggestion was carefully crafted to grant Rome titular supremacy while preserving Constantinople's practical autonomy. It stated that, with the consent of the Roman pontiff, the Church of Constantinople shall be considered universal within its sphere, just as Rome is within the universe. John XIX was inclined to accept the arrangement. However, the Cluniac abbot of St. Benignus at Dijon intervened with a forceful letter, reminding him that the authority to bind and loose in heaven and on earth was entrusted solely to St. Peter and his successors. The abbot urged the pope to govern the universal church with greater resolve. Byzantium would soon learn that the Reformed papacy was unwilling to accept such compromises. By the middle of the century, the Norman incursions into southern Italy made a political alliance between the pope and the Eastern emperor desirable. However, the Reformed papacy was now firmly committed to its policy of standardization, seeking to eliminate Greek practices prevalent in the churches of southern Italy, which had also been adopted by numerous Italian churches as far north as Milan. In 1043, Michael Cerularius, a proud and ambitious man, became Patriarch of Constantinople. He was equally determined to enforce uniformity within his own jurisdiction. Initially, his motivation was to integrate the newly acquired Armenian provinces, where distinct customs, such as the use of unleavened bread, were observed. However, his efforts also extended to the Latin churches in Byzantine-controlled Italy and to those in Constantinople, which served merchants, pilgrims, and members of the Varangian Guard. When these Latin churches refused to comply with his regulations, Cerularius ordered their closure and began circulating pamphlets denouncing Latin practices. Cerularius, however, appeared less concerned with theological matters. He was willing to restore the Pope's name to the diptychs in exchange for reciprocal recognition at Rome. The conflict primarily centered on ritual practices, bringing to the forefront the issue of ecclesiastical boundaries in Italy. Negotiations were initiated by Argerus, the Lombard governor of Byzantine Italy, a Byzantine subject who practiced the Latin rite. While the emperor trusted Argerus, Cerularius remained wary, and events soon favored his position. In 1053, before any papal envoys could be dispatched to Constantinople, Pope Leo IX was captured by the Normans. When the papal legates, led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, finally arrived in Constantinople in January 1054, they were received honorably by the emperor. Nevertheless, Cerularius questioned both their official appointment and the pope's ability, while in captivity, to authorize any commitments they might make. In April, before meaningful discussions could progress, Pope Leo IX died. The legates, having lost their official mandate, found themselves in an uncertain position, as the next pope would not be elected for another year, leaving his policies unknown. Cerularius refused to continue the negotiations. Despite the emperor's wish for reconciliation, tensions escalated. Eventually, the legates departed in anger, leaving a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia, condemning the patriarch and his close advisors, but explicitly acknowledging the orthodoxy of the Byzantine Church as a whole. In response, Cerularius convened a synod that rejected the bull as the work of 3 unauthorized individuals. The synod condemned the addition of filioque to the creed and the persecution of married clergy, but it made no general condemnation of the Roman Church or other disputed practices. In reality, nothing changed. The patriarchates of Alexandria and Jerusalem remained uninvolved. Peter III, the Patriarch of Antioch, considered Cerularius unnecessarily obstinate. His church continued to include the Pope's name in its diptychs and saw no reason to stop. He likely feared that Cerularius, whose ambitions he distrusted, harbored intentions against the independence of Antioch. Peter sympathized more with the emperor's position and opposed the drive for uniform liturgical practices, as his diocese encompassed churches using the Syrian liturgy, many of which lay beyond the empire's political borders. Even if he had desired uniformity, he could not have imposed it. Thus, he remained apart from the conflict. Over the following decade, relations saw a slight improvement. Michael Cerularius was deposed in 1059, and not long after his removal, the Latin churches in Constantinople were reopened. In southern Italy, the Normans, who had become loyal allies of the papacy since 1059, were increasingly successful, making it unfeasible for Byzantium to maintain its ecclesiastical claims in the region. In 1061, Roger the Norman launched the conquest of Sicily from the Arabs, a holy war encouraged by the Pope. Here, too, Byzantium faced the loss of control over its Christian communities. By 1073, Emperor Michael VII recognized the necessity of fostering a good relationship with Rome. Following the Norman capture of Bari in 1071, he feared further Norman aggression, which papal influence might help to prevent. At the same time, the Turcoman invasion of Asia Minor had begun, leaving Michael desperate for soldiers. Recruiting troops from the west would be more feasible if relations with the papacy were warm. In 1073, Cardinal Hildebrand, already renowned for his vigor and integrity, was elected pope under the name Gregory VII. Firmly convinced of the supremacy of his office, Gregory chose not to send a systematic letter to any of the Eastern patriarchs. Nonetheless, Michael made a diplomatic overture, sending the new pope a letter of congratulations, subtly expressing his desire for closer ties. Pleased by the gesture, Gregory dispatched Dominicus, the Patriarch of Grado, as his legate to Constantinople to assess the situation. After receiving Dominicus's reports, Gregory became convinced of Michael's sincerity. He also learned of the deteriorating situation in Asia Minor. While pilgrimage to Palestine was still possible, the route across Anatolia would soon be perilous if the Turcoman advance was not halted. Inspired by this crisis, Gregory devised an ambitious new plan. The Holy War, already being fought successfully in Spain, should be expanded into Asia. His allies in Byzantium needed military assistance, and he would provide it by sending an army of Christian knights under church authority. This time, due to the accompanying ecclesiastical issues, the Pope himself would lead the expedition. Gregory envisioned his forces driving the infidels out of Asia Minor. Afterwards, he would convene a council in Constantinople, where the grateful Eastern Christians would resolve their disputes and recognize Rome's supremacy. Whether Emperor Michael was aware of Gregory's full intentions, or whether he would have welcomed them, remains uncertain. In the end, Gregory was never able to realize his plan. His rigid adherence to his policies drew him into escalating conflicts in the West, forcing him to abandon his Eastern ambitions. Yet, he never forgot them, nor did he lose interest in the East. In 1078, Michael VII was deposed. Upon hearing the news, Gregory immediately excommunicated the usurper, Nicephorus Batiniates. Shortly thereafter, an impostor appeared in Italy, claiming to be the deposed emperor. For a time, the Normans pretended to recognize him, and Gregory offered him his support. When Nicephorus was eventually replaced in April 1081 by Alexius Comnenus, the excommunication was extended to the new emperor as well. In June, Alexius wrote to the Pope in an attempt to regain his favor and to seek assistance against the aggression of Robert Guiscard. However, no reply came from Rome. Instead, Alexius turned to Henry IV of Germany, who proved a more promising ally. Meanwhile, Alexius ordered the closure of the Latin churches in Constantinople. To the Byzantines, it appeared evident that the Pope had allied himself with the treacherous and impious Normans. They exchanged wild tales about his arrogance and lack of compassion, and when Gregory died, they saw his death as divine retribution. By 1085, the year of Gregory's death, relations between the Eastern and Western churches had reached an unprecedented low. The Eastern emperor had been excommunicated, and the Pope was actively encouraging opportunistic adventurers to attack fellow Christians, while his primary adversary, the German king, was openly receiving financial support from Byzantium. Hostility and resentment continued to grow on both sides. Yet, no formal schism had occurred. The unity of Christendom could still, in theory, be preserved through wise diplomacy. The East had an emperor Alexius, a leader with the flexibility and foresight of a true statesman. A man of similar caliber was about to emerge in the West. Odo de Lagari was born around 1042 into a noble family from Châtillon-sur-Marne. For his education, he was sent to the cathedral school at Reims, where his teacher was Saint Bruno, who would later found the Carthusian order. Remaining in Reims, Odo rose to the positions of canon and then archdeacon, but he found these roles unsatisfying. Abruptly, he chose to retire to the monastic community at Cluny. In 1070, he was accepted into the monastery by Abbot Hugh, who quickly recognized his talents. After serving for some time as prior, Odo was sent to Rome, where he rapidly distinguished himself. In 1078, Gregory VII appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. From 1082 to 1085, he served as legate in France and Germany, returning afterward to remain by Gregory's side during the Pope's troubled final years. Upon Gregory's death in exile, with the anti-Pope Guibert controlling Rome, the loyal cardinals reluctantly elected the hesitant abbot of Monte Cassino, who took the name Victor III. The Cardinal of Ostia disapproved of the election and made his dissatisfaction known. Yet Victor bore him no resentment, and on his deathbed in September 1087, he recommended him to the cardinals as his successor. Gregory VII, too, had expressed his wish for Odo's succession. Nevertheless, it was not until March 1088 that a conclave convened in Terracina and elected him as Pope Urban II. Urban was well suited for his role. He was an imposing figure. While he lacked the passion and single-minded determination of Gregory VII, he surpassed him in vision and skill in dealing with others. He was neither as proud nor as stubborn as Gregory, though he was by no means weak. His loyalty to the Pope and his principles had even led to his imprisonment in Germany at the hands of Henry IV. Urban could be stern and unyielding when necessary, but he preferred gentleness and sought to avoid conflicts that might breed bitterness and discord. He inherited a challenging situation. His safety was assured only in Norman-controlled territories, and even there, the Normans were often selfish and unreliable allies. Rome itself remained under the control of the anti-Pope Guibert. Urban could venture into the outskirts of the city, but entering further would have provoked bloodshed. Further north, Matilda of Tuscany remained his steadfast supporter across her vast holdings. In 1089, she further strengthened her position through a calculated marriage to Welf of Bavaria, a German prince less than half her age. However, in 1091, Matilda's forces suffered a crushing defeat by Henry of Germany at the Battle of Trisanti. At this point, Henry stood at the peak of his power. Crowned emperor by the anti-pope in 1084, he ruled Germany and dominated northern Italy. A pope as precariously positioned as Urban had little hope of commanding obedience beyond his immediate sphere. Nevertheless, Urban continued his patient and diplomatic efforts, and by 1093, the situation had dramatically shifted. Through the strategic use of financial resources rather than military force, he was able to celebrate Christmas that year in Rome and soon afterward took up residence in the Lateran Palace. Henry's strength began to wane due to the rebellion of his own son, Conrad. In France, his homeland, Urban successfully brought the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy under his authority through careful organization. In Spain, his influence was unrivaled, and gradually, even the more distant realms of the West came to acknowledge his spiritual supremacy. He refrained from pursuing the claims of political sovereignty that Gregory VII had once asserted. With secular rulers, he exercised patience and restraint to the fullest extent. By 1095, Urban had firmly established himself as the spiritual leader of Western Christendom. Meanwhile, Urban shifted his focus toward the Eastern Church. Following Robert Guiscard's death, his brother Roger of Sicily emerged as the leading figure among the Normans. Roger had no desire to further antagonize Byzantium, and with his cooperation, Urban initiated negotiations with the Byzantine court. At the Council of Melfi in September 1089, in the presence of imperial envoys, Urban lifted the excommunication of Emperor Alexius. In response, Alexius convened a synod in Constantinople that same month. The synod concluded that the pope's name had been omitted from the diptychs not by any canonical decree, but rather through a kind of negligence. It was proposed that his name could be restored once a systatic letter was received from the pope. The synod saw no real grounds for dispute between the churches and recommended that the patriarchs of Alexandria and Jerusalem also be consulted. The Patriarch of Antioch was present at the gathering in person. Patriarch Nicholas III of Constantinople wrote to Urban, informing him of these decisions and requesting that he send his systatic letter within 18 months. He assured the Pope that the Latin churches in Constantinople were free to maintain their own customs. No mention was made of any theological controversies. However, this approach displeased the emperor's ambassadors in Italy, Greek clerics concerned by papal advances into their regions. They were particularly disturbed when Urban asserted, with some historical justification, that Thessalonica should fall under his jurisdiction. These envoys would have preferred that Alexius side with the anti-pope. But Alexius, recognizing who was the stronger leader, pragmatically accepted the loss of Byzantine Italy. Meanwhile, Guibert, the anti-pope, quickly alienated his Greek supporters by convening a council in Rome that condemned clerical marriage. Urban never did send the systatic letter, likely because he wished to avoid raising theological issues. As a result, his name was never added back into the Constantinople diptychs. Nevertheless, relations between East and West improved. In 1090, a Byzantine embassy visited Urban bearing a message of goodwill from Alexius. The Byzantine perspective was further expressed in a treatise by Theophylact, Archbishop of Bulgaria, who urged his readers not to exaggerate the significance of differing liturgical practices. He regretted the addition of filioque to the creed, but attributed it to the limitations of Latin theological language, which often led to misunderstanding. He dismissed any serious papal claim of authority over the Eastern churches, suggesting that there was no real reason for a schism to occur. Other Eastern theologians continued to debate differences in liturgical customs, but their writings remained moderate in tone. Among them was Simeon II, Patriarch of Jerusalem, who criticized the Latin use of unleavened bread for communion, though without any harsh rhetoric. In early 1095, Pope Urban II departed Rome and called for the first major council of his pontificate, summoning representatives from the entire Western Church to meet him at Piacenza in March. The council passed decrees against simony, clerical marriage, and schism within the Church. The case of King Philip of France's adultery was discussed, though action was deferred until Urban could travel to France himself. Envoys arrived from Emperor Henry's son, Conrad, seeking to arrange a meeting with the Pope at Cremona. Empress Praxedis of Russia, from the Scandinavian dynasty ruling in Kiev, came in person to describe the humiliations she had endured at the hands of her husband. The council served as the supreme court of Western Christendom, with the Pope presiding as its chief judge. Among the visitors attending the council were envoys from Emperor Alexius. His campaigns against the Turks were progressing favorably. The Seljuk power was clearly weakening, and a few well-timed offensives might shatter it entirely. Yet his empire still faced a severe shortage of soldiers. The traditional recruiting grounds in Anatolia were disrupted, many of them now lost. As a result, he relied heavily on foreign mercenaries. Regiments of Pecheneg and other steppe tribes served primarily as border guards and military police, while the Varangian Guard, still largely composed of Anglo-Saxon exiles from Norman-conquered England, formed his elite force. In addition, he employed bands of Western adventurers who temporarily served in his army. The most notable among these had been Count Robert I of Flanders, who had fought for Alexius in 1090. But even with the native forces still available to him, Alexius found his military resources insufficient. The long Danube frontier required constant vigilance against raids from northern barbarian tribes. In the northwest, the Serbs remained restless, and the Bulgarian subjects of the empire were rarely quiet for long. The threat of Norman aggression from Italy also loomed continuously. In Asia Minor, defending the vague and unstable frontiers, maintaining the distant outposts, and ensuring communication lines demanded much of his remaining strength. If Alexius was to launch an offensive campaign, he urgently needed more recruits. His diplomatic outreach to the papacy was intended to secure papal influence in raising these additional forces. Urban was receptive to his appeal. It fit well within the papal strategy to redirect the bellicose energies of the Western Knights toward a distant and sacred cause. The Byzantine ambassadors were invited to address the council assembly. Although their speeches have not survived, it appears that, to persuade the audience of the righteousness of fighting under the emperor, they emphasized the sufferings endured by Eastern Christians as long as the infidels remained unchecked. Simply offering soldiers the promise of good wages would not suffice to inspire widespread recruitment. An appeal to Christian duty provided a far more compelling incentive. This was not the time for a detailed analysis of Byzantine motives or successes. Instead, the envoys sought to leave the bishops with the impression that Christendom remained under serious threat. Inspired by this sense of urgency, the bishops would be eager to send men from their congregations eastward to join the Christian army. The bishops were deeply moved by the message. As Urban traveled onward to Cremona to receive the homage of young Conrad, and then crossed the Alpine passes into France, a grander vision began to take shape in his mind: the prospect of a holy war. Pope Urban arrived in France in the late summer of 1095. On August 5th, he was in Valence, reaching Le Puy on August 11th. From there, he dispatched letters to the bishops of France and nearby regions, summoning them to gather at Clermont in November. Meanwhile, he traveled south, spending September in Provence, visiting Avignon and St. Gilles. In early October, he arrived in Lyons, then proceeded into Burgundy. On October 25th, at Cluny, he consecrated the high altar of the great basilica begun by Abbot Hugh. From Cluny, he continued on to Souvigny, near Moulins, to honor the tomb of the most venerated Cluniac abbot, St. Milas. There, the Bishop of Clermont joined him to escort him to his episcopal city, where preparations for the council were underway. As he journeyed, Urban actively attended to the affairs of the Church in France. But his travels also allowed him to further pursue his larger vision. It is unclear whether he personally met Raymond of St. Gilles, Count of Toulouse and Marquis of Provence, who was already renowned for leading holy wars in Spain. However, Urban was certainly in communication with him and aware of his experiences. At Cluny, he also conversed with individuals familiar with pilgrim routes, both to Compostela and Jerusalem, who described the severe hardships faced by pilgrims to Palestine due to the collapse of Turkish authority. Urban learned that not only were the routes across Asia Minor impassable, but the Holy Land itself was effectively closed to pilgrims. The Council of Clermont convened from November 18th to November 28th, 1095. Around 300 clerics attended, addressing a broad range of issues. Decrees were reaffirmed against lay investiture, simony, and clerical marriage, while the truce of God was promoted. King Philip of France was excommunicated for adultery. The Bishop of Cambrai was condemned for simony, and the primacy of the See of Lyons over Sens and Reims was confirmed. But Urban intended to use the council for a far more significant purpose. It was announced that on Tuesday, November 27th, he would hold a public session to deliver a great proclamation. The crowds were so large that they could not be contained within the cathedral where the council's earlier sessions had been held. A platform was erected outside the eastern gate of the city, and there, before the gathered multitude, Urban rose to address them. For contemporary chroniclers have preserved accounts of Urban's speech. Robert the Monk claims to have been present, while Baudry of Dole and Fulcher of Chartres write as though they had witnessed it firsthand. The fourth, Guibert of Nogent, likely based his version on second-hand information. None claim to record Urban's exact words, and each account, written years later, reflects the influence of subsequent events. Thus, we can only approximate what Urban actually said. He likely began by emphasizing the urgent need to assist their fellow Christians in the East. The Eastern Church had appealed for aid, as the Turks were advancing into Christian lands, brutalizing the population and defiling sacred sites. Urban spoke not only of Byzantium, but also of Jerusalem, highlighting its exceptional holiness and describing the torments suffered by pilgrims trying to reach it. After portraying these dire circumstances, he issued his momentous call. Western Christendom, he urged, must rise to defend the East. Rich and poor alike should take up the cause. Instead of warring against one another, they should fight a just war in service of God, who would guide them. For those who perished in battle, there would be absolution and forgiveness of sins. Life at home, he warned, was full of misery and vice, leaving men physically and spiritually broken. In the East, however, they would find joy, prosperity, and true friendship with God. There must be no hesitation. They should prepare to depart when summer arrived, with God leading the way. Urban spoke with passion and the skill of a master orator. The response was swift and overwhelming. Shouts of Deus le Volt interrupted his address. Hardly had the Pope finished speaking when the Bishop of Le Puy stood up, knelt before the papal throne, and begged permission to join the sacred expedition. Hundreds immediately followed his example, crowding forward to make their own pledges. Then Cardinal Gregory dropped to his knees and recited the Confiteor aloud, which was repeated in unison by the vast assembly. When the prayer concluded, Urban stood again, granted absolution, and dismissed the gathering. The enthusiasm exceeded what Urban had anticipated. His plans for channeling this excitement were not yet fully in place. No prominent secular lord had been present at Clermont. Those volunteering so far were primarily men of humbler status. Stronger support from leading nobles would be essential. Meanwhile, Urban reconvened his bishops for further deliberation. The council, likely at his earlier urging, had already decreed that those who took part in the holy war with sincere intentions would be granted remission from temporal penalties for their sins. Now additional measures were adopted. The property of participants would be placed under the Church's protection for the duration of their absence. The local bishop would be responsible for safeguarding these belongings and returning them intact upon the warrior's return. Every participant was to wear the symbol of the cross as a sign of his dedication. Each man who took the cross vowed to journey to Jerusalem. If he abandoned the expedition prematurely or failed to depart, he would face excommunication. Clergy and monks were forbidden to join the campaign without permission from their bishop or abbot. The elderly and infirm were to be discouraged from attempting the journey, and no one should undertake it without first consulting his spiritual advisor. This was not to be a war of conquest. In every city reclaimed from the infidels, the Eastern churches were to have their rights and possessions fully restored. All participants were to be ready to depart by the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th of the following year, after the harvests were complete. The armies were to gather at Constantinople. A leader for the expedition had to be chosen. Urban wished to ensure that the campaign remained under church authority, so its head would be an ecclesiastical figure. With the unanimous approval of the council, he appointed the Bishop of Le Puy. Adhemer de Monteil, Bishop of Le Puy, came from the noble family of the Counts of Valentinois. He was a middle-aged man who had previously completed a pilgrimage to Jerusalem 9 years earlier. He earned this leadership role by being the first to answer Urban's call. However, since he had hosted Urban at Le Puy that August and likely discussed matters of the East with him then, it is possible that his dramatic gesture had been partly prearranged. Regardless, it was a wise selection. In the months to come, Adhemer proved to be an excellent preacher and a skilled diplomat, broad-minded, composed, and gracious. He consistently worked to temper passions and promote goodwill, though at times he lacked the firmness necessary to fully control the powerful nobles who were theoretically subject to his leadership. The first of the great lords to request participation in the expedition was Count Raymond of Toulouse. On December 1st, while Urban was still at Clermont, messengers arrived with news that Raymond and many of his nobles were eager to take the cross. Since Raymond was at Toulouse at the time, he could not have heard about the momentous speech at Clermont. As the first noble informed of the project and the first to take the vow, Raymond believed he was entitled to assume secular leadership over the other great lords. He envisioned himself as the Moses to Adhemer's Aaron. Urban, however, would not recognize such a claim, though Raymond never fully relinquished his ambition. Nevertheless, he intended to work loyally alongside Adhemer. Urban departed Clermont on December 2nd. After visiting various Cluniac monasteries, he spent Christmas at Limoges, where he preached the Crusade in the cathedral. Then, traveling north through Poitiers, he reached the Loire Valley. In March, he arrived in Tours, where he held a council. One Sunday, he summoned a large gathering to a meadow along the riverbank. Standing on an improvised platform, he delivered a long and solemn sermon, calling on his audience to repent and join the crusade. From Tours, Urban traveled south again, passing through Aquitaine, Saintes, and Bordeaux before arriving in Toulouse. He remained in Toulouse throughout May and June, giving him ample opportunity to discuss the crusade with his host, Count Raymond. In late June, the Pope continued on to Provence, accompanied by Raymond as far as Nîmes. By August, Urban had crossed the Alps back into Lombardy. This journey was far from a leisurely tour. Throughout his travels, Urban held numerous meetings with church officials and wrote letters, tirelessly pursuing the reorganization of the church in France and, most importantly, advancing his plans for the crusade. Synodal letters containing the decisions made at Clermont were sent to bishops across the West. In some areas, provincial councils convened to receive these decrees and consider local implementation. It is likely that major secular leaders were also officially informed of the Pope's intentions. From Limoges, at the end of 1095, Urban addressed all the faithful in Flanders, referring them to the acts of the council at Clermont and calling for their support. The response from Flanders and nearby regions was overwhelmingly positive. In July 1096, while Urban was at Nîmes, King Philip sent a message announcing his complete submission regarding his previous adultery. That same month, Raymond of Toulouse demonstrated his commitment by donating much of his property to the monastery of St. Gilles. It may have been on Raymond's advice that Urban recognized the need for a maritime power to support the expedition supply lines. Accordingly, 2 papal legates traveled to Genoa with letters requesting the Republic's cooperation. Genoa agreed to provide 12 galleys and transport ships, but cautiously postponed their deployment until they could assess whether the crusade was a serious and viable endeavor. It was only in July 1097 that this fleet finally set sail from Genoa. In the meantime, many Genoese citizens took the cross themselves. By the time Urban returned to Italy, the success of his initiative was assured. His call had been enthusiastically answered. From places as distant as Scotland, Denmark, and Spain, men rushed to take their vows. Some financed their journey by pawning their possessions and land, while others, believing they would never return, surrendered everything to the church. A substantial number of prominent nobles had joined the crusade, providing it with significant military strength. Alongside Raymond of Toulouse and Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Flanders, Robert, Duke of Normandy, and his brother-in-law Stephen, Count of Blois, were preparing to depart. Even more striking was the participation of men loyal to Emperor Henry IV, chief among them Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, who took the cross along with his brothers, Eustace, Count of Boulogne, and Baldwin. Around these leaders gathered numerous minor nobles and a few prominent clergy, including the Bishop of Bayeux. In Italy, Urban found similar zeal. In September 1096, he wrote to the city of Bologna, expressing gratitude for their enthusiasm, but cautioning them not to depart for the east without permission from their priests. Newly married men, he advised, should not leave without their wives' consent. Meanwhile, word of the crusade reached southern Italy, where many Normans, always eager for new ventures, welcomed it enthusiastically. Initially, the princes hesitated, but Bohemond, son of Guiscard and now Prince of Taranto, soon recognized the opportunity the crusade offered. He took the cross along with many relatives and friends, bringing with him some of the most skilled and ambitious soldiers in Europe. When Urban returned to Rome in time for Christmas 1096, he could be confident that the crusade had truly begun. In reality, he had initiated a movement far greater than he could have foreseen. It might have been better if fewer powerful lords had answered his call. although most, apart from Bohemond, were driven primarily by genuine religious zeal. Their worldly ambitions and rivalries would soon create challenges far beyond the papal legate's ability to manage. Even more difficult to control was the overwhelming response from common people throughout France, Flanders, and the Rhineland. The Pope had instructed his bishops to preach the Crusade, but the most effective preaching came from humble evangelicals, such as Robert of Arbrissel, founder of the Order of Fontevraud, and, even more so, from a wandering monk named Peter. Peter, an elderly man born near Amiens, had likely attempted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem a few years earlier, only to be mistreated by the Turks and forced to abandon his journey. His contemporaries called him Little Peter, but he became better known to history as Peter the Hermit, named after the simple hermit's cloak he always wore. Short, dark, with a long, thin face that resembled the donkey he rode, Peter cut a peculiar figure. He went barefoot, wore filthy clothes, ate no bread or meat, only fish, and drank wine. Yet, despite his humble appearance, he had an extraordinary ability to move people. There was an undeniable aura of strange authority about him. As Guibert of Nogent, who knew him personally, remarked, whatever he said or did, it seemed almost half divine. Peter likely had not been present at the Council of Clermont. However, by the end of 1095, he was already actively preaching the Crusade. He began his mission in Berry and, during February and March, traveled through Orléans and Champagne into Lorraine, then continued past the cities along the Meuse and Aachen, finally reaching Cologne, where he spent Easter. Along the way, he gathered followers, some of whom he dispatched to preach in areas he could not personally visit. Among these were the Frenchmen Walter Sandoir, Reynold of Braise, Geoffrey Burel, and Walter of Breteuil, as well as the Germans Aurel and Gottschalk. Wherever Peter or his disciples appeared, both men and women left their homes to join him. By the time he reached Cologne, his following was estimated at around 15,000 people, with many more joining as he passed through Germany. The astonishing success of Peter's preaching can be attributed to multiple factors. Life for peasants in northwestern Europe was harsh and unstable. Large portions of land had fallen into disuse due to the barbarian invasions and Viking raids. Dikes had been breached, allowing the sea and rivers to reclaim fertile ground. Many lords resisted efforts to clear the forests, preferring to preserve their hunting grounds. Villages lacking the protection of a lord's castle were vulnerable to attacks from outlaws or marauding soldiers engaged in local feuds. Though the church tried to assist the poor and establish new settlements in unoccupied lands, its efforts were inconsistent and often ineffective. While some powerful lords promoted the growth of towns, minor nobles frequently opposed such developments. The existing manorial system was deteriorating, yet no new structure was taking its place. Though serfdom had largely disappeared, peasants remained bound to the land through obligations they could not easily escape. At the same time, population growth made it impossible to continue subdividing the already meager plots of farmland. As Urban reportedly stated at Clermont, according to Robert the monk, in this land you can scarcely feed the people. That is why you consume its resources and wage endless wars against one another. Recent years had been particularly harsh, with floods and pestilence in 1094 followed by drought and famine in 1095. At such a time, emigration held a powerful appeal. Indeed, a meteor shower in April 1095 was seen as a divine sign foreshadowing a great movement of people. Apocalyptic beliefs further fueled the desire to depart. It was an age filled with visions, and many regarded Peter as a prophet. Medieval Christians firmly believed the second coming was imminent. They felt compelled to repent while there was still time and to perform good deeds. The church taught that pilgrimage could atone for sin, and various prophecies insisted that the Holy Land must be reclaimed for the faith before Christ's return. Moreover, to many uneducated believers, the difference between Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem was unclear. Many of Peter's listeners thought he was leading them out of their present suffering into the biblical land of milk and honey. The journey would be arduous, with the forces of Antichrist to confront, but the ultimate destination was the golden city of Jerusalem. What Pope Urban truly thought of Peter and the remarkable success of his preaching remains unknown. His letter to the people of Bologna suggests he may have been somewhat uneasy about the unrestrained enthusiasm spreading among the faithful. Still, whether by choice or necessity, he did not stop it from expanding across Italy. Throughout the summer of 1096, a steady trickle of pilgrims, lacking leadership or any form of organization, began making their way eastward. Urban no doubt hoped that these groups, along with Peter's followers, would safely reach Constantinople and wait there for the arrival of his legate and the appointed military leaders, who would incorporate them into the structured ranks of the greater Crusader army. Urban's firm instruction that the expedition should gather at Constantinople reveals his confidence that Emperor Alexius would welcome their arrival. After all, Byzantium had requested military assistance from the West. However, Urban's optimism was somewhat naive. While any government may desire allies, it becomes wary when those allies march massive armies into its territory, demanding to be fed, housed, and provided for. Such developments naturally prompted anxiety and alarm in Constantinople once word of the crusading movement reached the imperial court. By 1096, the Byzantine Empire had been enjoying a rare period of calm. The emperor had recently crushed a Cuman invasion of the Balkans so thoroughly that none of the nomadic tribes from the steppes dared to challenge the border again for some time. In Asia Minor, a series of civil wars had begun to unravel the power of the Seljuk Empire. Alexius was preparing to launch an offensive against the weakened Turks, but he preferred to choose the timing of his campaign carefully. His resources remained strained, and he needed additional time to rebuild. A shortage of manpower was one of his chief concerns. Mercenaries from the West were highly desirable, and he likely hoped that his ambassadors in Italy were successful in recruiting individual knights and small detachments. Instead, he now learned that entire Frankish armies were on the march. This was not welcome news. The Franks, as Alexius knew from experience, were a volatile people. Their strength in battle was undeniable, but under these circumstances, such strength posed its own risks. The imperial court was uneasy, and as the Princess Anakamena described it, all the West and all the barbarian peoples from beyond the Adriatic to the Pillars of Hercules were moving together across Europe toward Asia, bringing even their families along. Both the emperor and his subjects grew increasingly apprehensive. As a kind of ominous sign, vast swarms of locusts swept over the empire. Strangely, they spared the wheat fields but ravaged the vineyards. Influenced perhaps by imperial officials eager to calm public fears, local soothsayers interpreted the event to mean that the Franks, like the locusts, would leave true Christians unharmed but would devastate the Saracens, whose indulgent nature was represented by the vine. Princess Anna herself was somewhat skeptical of this comforting interpretation. Nevertheless, the comparison between the Franks and the locust swarms was hard to ignore. Emperor Alexius calmly began to prepare for the arrival of the Frankish armies. As these forces would need to be supplied with food while passing through the empire, it was essential to prevent them from plundering the countryside or harming the local population. Provisions were stockpiled at key locations along their projected routes, and special policing units were assigned to meet each contingent upon its entry into imperial territory, escorting them safely to Constantinople. Two main routes crossed the Balkan Peninsula. The northern route entered at Belgrade, continuing southeast through Niš, Sofia, Philippopolis, and Adrianople. The second route was the Via Egnatia, stretching from Dyrrhachium through Achrida and Edessa, Vodina, to Thessalonica, and then on to Mosinopolis and Salimbria before reaching the capital. Since the large German pilgrimage of 1064, the northern route had seen little use by Western travelers. The numbers of pilgrims had declined, and those who made the journey typically favored the Via Egnatia instead. Furthermore, because Alexius was receiving most of his information about the Crusade from Italy, he reasonably expected that the majority of the Frankish forces would cross the Adriatic Sea and follow the Via Egnatia. To prepare, supplies were sent ahead to Dyrrhachium and the cities along this route. The governor of Dyrrhachium, John Comnenus, was instructed to extend a warm welcome to the Frankish leaders, while ensuring that their movements were constantly monitored by the military police. Senior envoys from Constantinople would be dispatched to greet each arriving commander. Meanwhile, Admiral Nicholas Mavrocordakalon took a fleet into the Adriatic to patrol the coastline and give advance warning of any incoming Frankish transports. The emperor himself remained in Constantinople, awaiting further reports. Since the Pope had scheduled the expedition to depart on August 15th, Alexius believed he still had ample time to complete his preparations. But unexpectedly, at the end of May 1096, a messenger arrived hastily from the north with alarming news. The first Frankish army had already crossed through Hungary and entered imperial territory at Belgrade. Peter the Hermit reached Cologne with his followers on Holy Saturday, April 12, 1096. There, he began to grasp the challenges facing a leader of a mass popular movement. The immense and diverse crowd he had gathered included people from various regions and social backgrounds. Some brought their wives and children. Most were peasants, but there were also townspeople, younger sons of noble families, former outlaws, and criminals. Their shared bond was the intensity of their religious zeal. Having forsaken all their possessions to follow Peter, they were eager to press onward. Moreover, it was necessary to keep them moving in order to feed them, as few regions in medieval Europe had enough surplus provisions to sustain such a large group for long. Cologne, however, stood amidst fertile lands with excellent river transport, and Peter saw an opportunity to pause and preach to the local Germans. He likely hoped to attract some of the regional nobility to his cause. In France and Flanders, knights preferred to enlist under powerful lords, but no great German lord had yet joined the crusade. His preaching found success, and several members of the minor German nobility responded, including Count Hugh of Tübingen, Count Henry of Schwarzenberg, Walter of Teck, and the three sons of the Count of Zimmern. The Frenchmen, however, were impatient. Walter Sanzawar decided not to delay in Cologne. Shortly after the Easter celebration, likely on Easter Tuesday, he departed with several thousand compatriots, setting out toward Hungary. Traveling up the Rhine and the Neckar, and then following the Danube, they reached Hungary's frontier by May 8th. There, Walter sent a request to King Koloman for safe passage and provisions. Koloman received them kindly, allowing them to cross Hungary peacefully. By the end of May, they reached Semlin on the far border, crossed the river Save, and entered Byzantine territory at Belgrade. The commander at Belgrade was caught off guard. Having received no instructions on how to handle such an influx, he hurriedly dispatched a message to Niš, where the Bulgarian provincial governor resided, to report Walter's arrival. The governor, a dutiful but undistinguished official named Nicetas, was equally unprepared. He in turn sent a courier racing to Constantinople with the news. Meanwhile, Walter's forces at Belgrade demanded food. As the harvest had yet to be gathered, the garrison could not provide enough supplies, and Walter's followers began looting the surrounding countryside. Tensions had already been heightened by an earlier incident at Semlin, where 16 of Walter's men were captured by Hungarians. These men were stripped of their weapons and clothing, which were then hung on the walls of Semlin as a warning before the captives were sent naked across the river to Belgrade. When the pillaging near Belgrade commenced, the commander responded with force. In the ensuing conflict, several of Walter's men were killed, and some were burned alive inside a church. Walter was eventually able to proceed to Niš, where Nicetas welcomed him and provided food, keeping him there until instructions arrived from Constantinople. The emperor, who had believed the crusade would not depart from the west until the Feast of the Assumption, was forced to accelerate his preparations. Nicetas was ordered to send Walter forward under escort. Accompanied by these escorts, Walter and his followers continued their journey peacefully. In early July, they reached Philippopolis, where Walter's uncle, Walter of Poissy, passed away, and by mid-month, they arrived in Constantinople. From Walter, Nicetas likely learned that Peter was not far behind, leading a significantly larger group. Nicetas, therefore, traveled up to Belgrade to meet him and establish communication with the Hungarian governor of Semlin. Peter had left Cologne around April 20th. Although at first the Germans had mocked his preaching, thousands eventually joined him, bringing his following to nearly 20,000 men and women. Other Germans, inspired by Peter's fervor, planned to follow later under the leadership of Gottschalk and Count Emich of Leisingen. From Cologne, Peter followed the usual route along the Rhine and Neckar to the Danube. Upon reaching the Danube, some of his followers chose to continue by boat down the river, while Peter and the bulk of his group continued overland along the road south of Lake Furdo, entering Hungary at Odenburg. Peter, as always, rode his donkey. The German knights were on horseback, and wagons carried supplies and a chest containing funds raised for the journey. The majority of his followers, however, traveled on foot. Where the roads permitted, they managed to cover around 25 miles each day. King Koloman received Peter's messengers with the same kindness he had shown Walter, warning them only that any acts of looting would be punished. The army peacefully crossed Hungary during late May and early June. Somewhere near Karlovci, the detachments that had traveled by boat rejoined the main body. On June 20th, they arrived at Semlin. There, their troubles began. The exact sequence of events remains unclear. It seems that the local governor, who was of Guz Turk origin, was alarmed by the size of Peter's army. In coordination with his counterpart across the frontier, he sought to tighten security. Peter's followers grew suspicious. They heard rumors about the hardships suffered by Walter's men and feared a plot against them by the two governors. They were also disturbed by the sight of the weapons taken from Walter's 16 men still displayed on Semlin city walls. Still, matters might have remained peaceful had it not been for a quarrel over the sale of a pair of shoes. This minor dispute escalated into a riot, which soon turned into open battle. Probably against Peter's wishes, his men, led by Geoffrey Burel, assaulted the town and managed to capture the citadel. 4,000 Hungarians were killed, and a large stockpile of provisions was seized. Fearing the retaliation of the Hungarian king, Peter's army quickly hurried across the Save River into Byzantine territory. They gathered as much wood as they could from the abandoned houses to construct rafts for crossing the river. Nicetas, observing anxiously from Belgrade, attempted to regulate the crossing by forcing them to use a single ford. His troops consisted primarily of Pecheneg mercenaries, reliable men who followed orders without question. He dispatched them in barges to prevent crossings at any unauthorized points. Recognizing that his forces were insufficient to control such a vast crowd, Nicetas withdrew to Niš, where the military headquarters of the province were located. Following his departure, the inhabitants of Belgrade fled the city, seeking refuge in the mountains. On June 26th, Peter's army forced its way across the Save River. When the Pechenegs attempted to confine them to one crossing point, they were attacked. Several of their boats were sunk, and the soldiers aboard were captured and executed. Once across, the Crusaders entered Belgrade, looted it thoroughly, and set it ablaze. They then marched for 7 days through dense forests, arriving at Niš on July 3rd. Upon arrival, Peter promptly sent a request to Nicetas for food supplies. Nicetas had already informed Constantinople of Peter's approach and was awaiting the arrival of imperial officials and military escorts to guide the Westerners to the capital. Although Niš had a substantial garrison, bolstered by additional locally recruited Pecheneg and Hungarian mercenaries, Nicetas likely could not spare troops to escort Peter's group until reinforcement from Constantinople arrived. However, allowing such a massive crowd to linger in Niš was impractical and dangerous. Therefore, Peter was asked to provide hostages while food was gathered for his followers and to resume the march as soon as possible. Initially, everything proceeded smoothly. Geoffrey Burel and Walter Oberturi were handed over as hostages. The local citizens not only permitted the Crusaders to obtain provisions, but also gave alms to the poorer pilgrims, with some even expressing a desire to join the journey. The following morning, the Crusaders resumed their march toward Sofia. As they were leaving Niš, some Germans who had quarreled with the townsmen the night before deliberately set fire to a cluster of mills by the river. Upon hearing of this, Nicetas dispatched troops to attack the rear of the column and capture some prisoners to hold as hostages. Peter, riding his donkey about a mile ahead, was unaware of the incident until a man named Lambert ran from the rear to inform him. He quickly returned to negotiate with Nicetas for the release of the captives. While they were negotiating, rumors of fighting and betrayal spread through the army. A group of impulsive crusaders launched an attack on Nish's fortifications. The garrison repelled them and then counterattacked, as Peter, trying to calm the situation, attempted to re-establish dialogue with Nicetas. Yet another faction resumed the assault. Nicetas then ordered his entire force to strike back at the Crusaders, who were completely routed and scattered. Many were killed, and many others were captured and spent the remainder of their lives in captivity nearby. Peter's money chest was also lost in the chaos. Peter himself, along with Reynold of Braise, Walter of Breteuil, and about 500 survivors, fled to the mountains, believing themselves to be the sole survivors. However, the following morning, 7,000 others regrouped and joined them. Continuing their march, they paused at the deserted town of Bela Palanka to gather the local harvest, as they were without provisions. There, additional stragglers caught up with the group. Even so, they discovered that they had lost about a quarter of their original number. They arrived in Sofia on July 12th. There they encountered the envoys and the military escort dispatched from Constantinople, who were instructed to keep the pilgrims well-provisioned and to ensure that they never lingered in any one place for more than 3 days. From that point forward, their journey proceeded without incident. The local population welcomed them warmly. At Philippopolis, the Greeks were so moved by tales of their hardships that they generously offered money, horses, and mules. Just 2 days outside of Adrianople, additional envoys met Peter, delivering a gracious message from the emperor. It was declared that the crimes of the expedition would be forgiven, as they had already suffered enough. Peter was overwhelmed with gratitude, shedding tears of joy at the benevolence shown by such a powerful ruler. The emperor's goodwill continued even after the Crusaders reached Constantinople on August 1st. Curious to meet the leader of this movement, Alexius summoned Peter to his court, where he provided him with money and sound counsel. Yet to Alexius's experienced eye, the expedition appeared undisciplined and ill-prepared. He feared that if they crossed into Asia, they would be swiftly defeated by the Turks. Their lawlessness prompted him to expedite their removal from the vicinity of Constantinople. The Crusaders committed constant thefts, breaking into suburban villas and palaces, even stripping lead from the roofs of churches. Though access into the city itself was carefully controlled, with only small groups allowed through the gates at a time, it was impossible to police the entire surrounding area. Walter Sandoval and his followers were already in Constantinople, and around the same time, various groups of Italian pilgrims arrived as well. They joined Peter's contingent, and on August 6th, the entire force was transported across the Bosphorus. Once on the Asiatic shore, they advanced along the Sea of Marmora toward Nicomedia, moving in a disorderly fashion, looting houses and churches along the way. Nicomedia, abandoned since its sack by the Turks 15 years earlier, lay empty. Their internal conflicts erupted between the Germans and Italians on one side and the French on the other. The Germans and Italians broke away from Peter's leadership and appointed an Italian nobleman named Reynold as their commander. Both groups proceeded westward along the southern coast of the Gulf of Nicomedia, arriving at a fortified camp called Sabotos by the Greeks, known as Civitate by the Crusaders. This camp had been prepared by Alexius for his English mercenaries near Helenopolis. Its fertile surroundings and proximity to Constantinople made it an ideal encampment, with supplies easily delivered by sea. Alexius had strongly advised Peter to wait for the arrival of the main crusading forces before launching any attacks against the infidels, and Peter himself was convinced of the wisdom of this counsel. However, Peter's influence over his followers was waning. Both Reynold's Germans and Italians, and the French under Geoffrey Burel, failed to maintain discipline. Instead of resting and rebuilding their strength, they competed in raiding the surrounding countryside. They first plundered the immediate area and then ventured into Turkish-controlled territory, looting villages inhabited by Christian Greeks. In mid-September, several thousand Frenchmen advanced as far as the outskirts of Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan ibn Suleiman. They sacked the suburban villages, seized flocks and herds, and inflicted horrific brutality on the Christian population. Reports claim that they roasted infants on spits. A Turkish force dispatched from Nicaea was repelled after intense fighting. The raiders then returned to Civitate, selling their plunder to fellow crusaders and Greek sailors stationed near the camp. The lucrative raid by the French sparked jealousy among the Germans. Toward the end of September, Reynold led a German force of approximately 6,000 men, including priests and even bishops, beyond Nicaea. As they advanced, they plundered the countryside, but, unlike the French, showed mercy to the local Christians. They eventually reached a castle known as Zeragordan, which they successfully seized. Discovering it well-stocked with supplies of every kind, they intended to use it as a base for further raids into the surrounding region. Upon hearing of the Crusaders' capture of Zeragordan, the Sultan dispatched a high-ranking commander with a substantial force to reclaim the stronghold. Zeragordan was situated atop a hill, with its water sources exposed to enemy control. The Turkish army arrived on St. Michael's Day, September 29th, easily defeating an ambush set by Reynold and securing both water sources. Trapped inside the castle, the Germans soon suffered terribly from thirst. They tried to extract moisture from the soil, cut the veins of their horses and donkeys to drink their blood, and even consumed each other's urine. Despite the priests' efforts to console and inspire them, despair grew. After 8 days of unbearable torment, Reynold chose to surrender. He opened the gates after receiving a promise that his life would be spared if he renounced Christianity. Those who remained steadfast in their faith were massacred, while Reynold and those who apostatized were taken captive and transported to Antioch, Aleppo, and far into Khorasan. News of the Germans' capture of Zeragordan reached the Crusader camp at Civitate early in October. Soon after, rumors spread through the camp, claiming that Nicaea itself had fallen and that the Turks were dividing its treasures. As the Turks anticipated, this false report incited wild excitement among the Crusaders, who demanded to march on Nicaea immediately, unaware that the Sultan had laid careful ambushes along the route. The leaders struggled to control their men until the devastating truth of Reynold's failed expedition became known. The initial excitement turned to panic, and the army's leaders convened to decide on their next course of action. Peter had traveled to Constantinople, his authority over the Crusaders having effectively collapsed. He hoped to regain influence by securing substantial support from the emperor. Meanwhile, a faction within the army advocated launching a retaliatory attack to avenge Zeragordan. However, Walter Savawar persuaded his fellow commanders to wait for Peter's return, which was expected in 8 days. But Peter did not return, and soon reports came that the Turks were advancing towards Civitate. The council met once more. The more cautious leaders advised restraint until Peter's return. Yet Geoffrey Burrell, backed by popular sentiment in the camp, insisted that it would be both cowardly and foolish to delay action against the approaching enemy. His argument prevailed. At dawn on October 21st, the entire Crusader force, numbering over 20,000 men, marched out of Civitate, leaving behind only the elderly, women, children, and the sick. Barely 3 miles from the camp, at the point where the road to Nicaea passed into a narrow wooded valley near the village of Draken, the Turks lay in wait. The Crusaders advanced noisily and carelessly, with their mounted knights leading the column. Suddenly, a volley of arrows burst from the woods, striking down or wounding the horses. As the animals reared and collapsed in confusion, throwing their riders, the Turks launched their attack. The cavalry, driven back and pursued by the Turks, collided with the oncoming infantry. Though many knights fought courageously, they could not prevent the panic that swept through the army. Within moments, The entire force was in chaotic retreat back towards Civitate. In the camp, daily life was just beginning. Some of the elderly were still asleep, while a few priests were celebrating early mass. The fleeing soldiers, followed closely by the enemy, burst into the camp in a frenzied wave. There was no organized resistance. Soldiers, women, and priests were slaughtered before they could even react. Some tried to flee into the surrounding forests or threw themselves into the sea, but few found safety for long. Others made a brief stand by setting fires, which the wind blew into the faces of the attacking Turks. Only young boys and girls who appealed to the Turks were spared, along with a few captives taken once the initial bloodshed subsided. These unfortunate souls were carried off into slavery. Around 3,000 survivors, luckier than most, managed to reach an abandoned castle by the sea. Though long and used, with doors and windows dismantled, the desperate refugees used scattered timber and even bones to create makeshift defenses. Their determination allowed them to withstand repeated Turkish assaults. The castle held firm, but elsewhere the battle was finished by midday. The ground from the pass at Draken to the sea was littered with corpses. Among the fallen were Walter Sanzawar, Reynold of Braise, Fulk of Orleans, Hugh of Tübingen, Walter of Teck, Conrad and Albert of Zimmern, along with many other German knights. The only leaders to survive were Geoffrey Burel Walter of Breteuil, William of Poissy, Henry of Schwarzenberg, Frederick of Zimmern, and Rudolf of Brandis, though most of them were gravely wounded. At nightfall, a Greek who had accompanied the army managed to find a boat and sailed to Constantinople to bring word to Peter and the emperor. No record remains of Peter's reaction, but Emperor Alexius acted immediately. He dispatched warships, manned with strong forces, to Civitate. Upon the arrival of the Byzantine fleet, the Turks lifted the siege of the castle and withdrew inland. The survivors were rescued, brought aboard the ships, and taken back to Constantinople, where they were housed in the suburbs. Thus ended the People's Crusade. It had claimed thousands of lives, severely tested the emperor's patience, and proved that faith alone, without wisdom and discipline, was insufficient to clear the path to Jerusalem.